Hello and welcome to the course Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. We have been in this week talking about different aspects of mental imagery. Last lecture was about cognitive maps, wherein we talked about different aspects of cognitive map and how, how closely related is our perception of these cognitive maps with respect to our actual navigation in the environment. So we talked about distances, we talked about some of the biases that are there, size, alignment bias, rotation bias, and those kind of things. Today, I'm kind of trying to put all of the things that we've talked about in this chapter on mental imagery. I'll try and put all of them together, and I'll try and work with you towards the resolution of this debate. Again, if there is a resolution possible, that is between the analog and the propositional representations. I'll also, in the latter half of my lecture today, talk a little bit about the fact that how the different brain areas are involved in processing visual imagery, and whether there are similarities or differences in the brain areas that are activated in actual visual perception and visual imagery. Again, that could be done for other things as well. So, let us, because we are getting to the close of this chapter now, let us revisit the imagery controversy. And what have we been talking about? We know that there are 2 points in the imagery controversy, and these 2 points, basically these 2 opinions, they differ in their emphasis on the similarity between mental imagery and the perception of actual physical stimuli. However, the 2 positions are not in any way completely different from each other, and they are there are sort of common strands in both of these things. They both might share a lot of explanations as well. Let us look at the analog viewpoint again. According to the analog perspective, we create a mental image of an object that closely resembles the actual physical object. So, we are kind of creating an analog representation which is exactly alike to the representation that we are creating, to the object whose representation we are creating exactly. So, the majority of research, you remember in the lecture before the last one, we talked about research with imagery and size, imagery and distance, imagery and shape, and those kind of things, and we saw that a majority of the research supports this position. The majority of research supports the analog account. No one argues that vision and mental imagery is identical, but still they say that they are very similar to each other. We have seen across the examples and experimental studies we have talked about, we have seen that these 2 things are very similar, if not exactly identical. Also, the neuropsychology research, we will talk about that later, provides especially strong evidence in favor of the analog view. It tells us that the mental imagery and visual perception as phenomena activate pretty much very similar areas in the in the cerebral cortex. So, it's again a co-locational thing as well. Now, Koslin and his colleagues have been developing the analog approach to visual imagery, and they have developed this still further by designing a model that has several different subsystems, some of which are shared using visual perception and mental imagery as well. So, a lot of these subsystems that they have actually designed are shared by visual perception and visual imagery. A representative subsystem in this model, basically developed by Koslin and colleagues, is the shifting of attention, and they say that we shift attention in much the same way during mental imagery versus when you are actually perceiving the objects. And there could be an example. Suppose, say for example, I ask you to form the mental image of a cat, and then later I ask you the question, does this cat have curved claws on its front paws? You will think over it, you kind of take a bit of time, take some moments, and then you would probably be able to answer this question. Why is this happening? Why are you taking so much time? Because you have created a picture, you should easily be able to pick this up and tell me. The aspect is that most people would basically report later that the original image actually did not even contain the claws. It probably contained mostly the torso of the cat, maybe the whiskers, eyes, ears, tail, legs, not really exactly the detail of what the claws look like, because you are not really attending to that entire thing. When I ask you about the claws, then your attention kind of zooms in to the legs and then zooms in to the claws, and then only you can actually tell me. So, it is basically you are creating that mental image of the claw because you want to answer my question. So, it is like you are shifting that attention, focusing that attention, much like you would do if I ask you to look at the cat and tell me whether the claws in front are curved or not. So, in summary, the analog viewpoint proposes that imagery resembles perception in so many respects, and the two processes even activate similar structures in the brain. In addition, the different subsystems which are responsible for both mental perception and mental imagery are shared, and they kind of share a lot of functions. Now, what happens as a result of this very close functionality of mental imagery and visual perception is the fact that our mental imagery can be very flexible. It can be useful across a wide variety of tasks. Now, let us come to the propositional viewpoint. What is the propositional viewpoint? The propositional viewpoint basically says that mental images are stored in an abstract language like form that does not physically resemble the original stimulus. So, the form in which you are storing, let us say, the layout of this room should does not necessarily have to be the image of this room. There could be other things as well. I could say that the door is on the right, and there is a table on the left, and there is at the corner there is a vase or some things like that, and I can just store this all in a description. And again, when I have to draw this, I can draw this verbal description, use this verbal description to draw the painting of this whole thing. Does not mean necessarily that I am storing the entire snapshot. So, this is what the propositional viewpoint argument is, and as I have been talking earlier as well, Zenon Pilchin was one of the people who proposed this and who has been arguing about this. So, Pilchin also agrees that people do experience mental images, but these are not a necessary component of your mental imagery. That is what Pilchin says. He argues that it could be impossible to store the information in terms of just images. It is just like it is probably very difficult. How many snapshots of area you traverse will you capture? Suppose, for example, you are taking you're taking across with you a video camera, and it's a high speed camera, and you are just taking it across the room or the street that you're walking in. If it's a fast enough camera, it's probably capturing 1000. Let's say it's a typical 1000 hertz, 2000 hertz camera. It's probably writing in 2000 images in a second. So, in that sense, there is too much information. The file size will be too much. It's probably going to be very impractical to be able to store information in that way. So, Pilchin kind of emphasizes that there are differences between the perceptual experiences and the way mental images are represented or the mental images are constructed. For example, if you remember the Chambers and Riceberg study, people could not mentally give the second interpretation unless they actually drew it from their memory. So, it's basically about the ambiguous figures experiment. So, it illustrates that people could not really reinterpret an ambiguous mental image such as the rabbit or the duck, even though they can easily do it when they are visually perceiving it. So, there is a difference between how visual perception works and how the mental imagery works. Again, in summary, you just again you take a step back, you look at evidences from both sides. It might actually be very difficult, or let us say rather impossible, to resolve the debate between whether it is exclusively analog or whether it is exclusively propositional. For now, the evidence that most of the researchers are going by is that they favor the analog code to explain most of the stimuli and most of the tasks. However, for a specific kinds of tasks, for specific situations, people have also accepted the propositional code or the propositional representation of mental imagery. So, this is this bit about the debate between the analog and the propositional code. Now, let me draw your attention to a slightly different topic. You might have heard many a times that there are gender differences in so many of the abilities that humans have, things like mathematical ability, verbal ability, and spatial ability. If these three were the only abilities that you want to talk about, and you might have heard that again and again that men are better in maths and women are worse in maths and those kind of things. So, Hyde in 2005 put together several meta-analysis. What is a meta-analysis? Meta-analysis I have talked about in the earlier lecture, in the earlier class. Meta-analysis is basically when you put together experiments about a particular phenomena, all of them together, you look at all of that data and look at what is the overall evidence that is being generated from so many of these studies put together. So, those are meta-analysis. Hyde actually summarized so many of the earlier meta-analysis done in 2005, and she published a paper and for borrowing this figure from Madeline, and it shows that again you can see that to the left the D is 0, whereas the difference, let us say, or the sensitivity you can say is 0, and to the rightmost you can see that the D is very large. So, if something is closer to 1, then you see that there is a very large difference between the ability. If it is closer to 0, the difference is much less. Okay. So, you can say that the D is close to 0. You will see in verbal ability there is close to 0. There are basically there are very few differences in males and females. In mathematical ability also there are very few differences in males and females, but in spatial ability you will see there are so many of these studies which say there is a large difference in one study, there is a moderate difference in 3 studies, and there is a small difference in 4 studies. So, overall there is documented a difference of a gender difference in at least the spatial ability. So, based on the meta analysis, it could be said that while there are gender similarities in mathematical ability and verbal ability, contrary to what you keep hearing in the news and you keep hearing people saying around you, there are actually gender differences only in spatial ability. That is pretty much what they found. Also in spatial ability, there are things like spatial visualization, you are imagining a particular place, or spatial perception, you are kind of perceiving the spatial aspects of the environment, and mental rotation. Out of these 3 as well, the largest amount of gender differences have been observed in the performance at the mental rotation kind of task. In the task that require some kind of mental rotation, there is where the only significant difference in the gender is found. And again, most of these things, I am actually not a really huge supporter of gender differences in different cognitive abilities. So, the whole point is that the difference in cognitive abilities with respect to even spatial abilities could be attributed back to the kind of experiences they have. Children and males and females have different exposure to different kind of toys, that they are exposed to different kind of practices, and those are the things that could be contributing to whatever gender difference you are observing across these meta analyses. So, this is again something to clarify. Now, let us move to the third part of today's lecture. Let us try and talk about the brain a little bit. Now, we look at different aspects of mental imagery and how the brain figures in here. So, let us first talk about at the neuronal level. So, Kreeman and colleagues in 2000, they were able to study patients who had electrodes implanted in their medial temporal lobes, and these basically electrodes were a part of to determine the source of where epileptic seizures are coming from. Now, they found that neurons that responded to some objects, there were particular neurons that would respond to particular objects, but not so many other objects. But there was a speciality about some of these neurons, that these neurons would respond to seeing baseballs, but not faces. Also, these neurons would respond to imagining baseballs as opposed to imagining faces. So, they will not only fire up when somebody is actually seeing a baseball right in front of them, they will also fire up when somebody is imagining a baseball. So, Kreeman basically calls these neurons as imagery neurons, because they are responding to both perceiving an actual object and imagining that particular object. So, that is about the neuronal level. Let us talk a little bit about about brain imaging. So, one of the early studies in brain imaging was done by Lebehan and co-workers back in 1993, and they demonstrated that both perception and imagery activate the visual cortex. They activate similar areas across the visual cortex. Now, activity was observed across the striate cortex, both when a person sees the actual visual object right there, and when the person is imagining this particular visual object. So, both of these things were both of these activities were causing some activation, some lighting up in the striate cortex. In another brain imaging experiment, the experimenters asked the participants to think about questions that involve imagery. So, I could ask you questions like, is the green of the tree, is the green of the trees darker than the green of the grass? So, if both of those things are not right in front of you, you will have to imagine the trees you've seen or the grass you've seen and compare their colors. So, these things would generate a greater response in the visual cortex as compared to the response which does not really elicit mental as opposed to the question that does not really elicit mental imagery. Things like a question like, is the intensity of electrical current measured in amperes? Now, you don't really need to do any mental imagery here to answer this kind of question. So, when mental imagery is there, there is larger activation even in the visual cortices. So, that is again something that they found. Now, there have been a number of very good recent brain imaging experiments, and they have also demonstrated an overlap between brain regions getting activated by perceiving an object and those activated by creating a mental image of a particular object. Okay. So, but along with this overlap, you'll find there are some differences that have also been reported. I'll talk about one of the major studies that I came across. So, Giorgio Janis and colleagues basically used fMRI to measure activation under two conditions, and the two conditions were perception and imagery. For the perception condition, the participants observed the drawing of an object like a tree. For the imagery condition, the participants were supposed to imagine a picture that they had studied before. So, they have seen the tree in a picture, and then the picture is no more there, and they have to imagine the picture of the tree. So, this is the perception and the imagery condition. For both the perception and the imagery conditions in this experiment, participants had to answer a simple question, and the question could be something like, is this object taller or it is wider? So, you just have to tell me something about the dimension of this mental image or the dimension of the picture in the perception case. The result from this experiment, result from Garnis's experiment shows that the activation occurs at 3 different sites. So, they have basically recorded activation from the frontal, from the middle, and from the back of the brain, and what they found is that at the frontal lobe there is activation for perception and imagery in 2 central columns, and there is a difference between perception and imagery in the right column. So, I will show you the results directly. So, these are the results from Giorgio Janis's experiment. In the first column, in the leftmost column, you will see the area that was being recorded from, and then you will see the perception activated areas, and you will see the imagery activated areas, and then you will see the difference areas. Okay. So, what is the difference between perception minus imagery? Are there any areas activated in perception that are not activated in imagery? Now, if you look at this, panel A is basically the responses of areas in the frontal lobe. You can see the recording is being done from the frontal lobe, and you will see pretty much very similar areas are activated in both perception and imagery, and therefore, you see no color in the rightmost column, that is perception minus imagery. Similarly, you look at the middle part of the brain, and you again find no color in the rightmost column here, which again tells you that exactly same areas are activated in perception and imagery conditions. At the back of the brain though, there is a difference. You will see some color in the rightmost part of the perception minus imagery when you are talking about the back of the brain, which probably might be attributed to the fact that for visual perception there is actually some physical stimulus, and this physical stimulus needs to be processed, which might not be the case with the imagery part. I will actually elaborate a little bit more about this fact when you are talking about one of the neuropsychologicals. So, this neuropsychological studies. So, this is again something that was found by Giorgio Janis's experiment. Now, let us move to the neuropsychological part of the studies. Now, there was a patient MGS, which was a young woman who was who was about to have her right part of the occipital lobe removed as a treatment for epilepsy. So, Mata Farah and colleagues, they basically had MGS perform the mental walk task, the one we have talked about in the last class. You have to walk towards a particular thing and indicate when this thing is overflowing your visual field. Okay. So, MGS was walking toward a particular object, and she could say that it is around 15 feet wherein this object has started overflowing my visual field. Post surgery, again the same task was done, and it was seen that MGS reported that this object was overflowing the visual field from as far as 35 feet now. Earlier it was 15 feet, now it was 35 feet, and why is this happening? It is happening because removing a part of the visual cortex has also reduced the size of her field of view, and so the field of view kind of fills up much quicker as compared to when it was in the pre-surgery condition. So, again you can see that there are some close relations at the brain level when you are talking about visual imagery and we are talking about mental perception. There have also been reports of dissociation between visual perception and mental imagery. For example, Garaglia and colleagues in 1993, they studied a patient whose brain damage had little effect on his ability to perceive, but it had created a sort of a neglect in his mental images. So this is one kind of patients that they have been found. On the other hand, Behrman and co-workers in 1994, they actually they were studying a patient called CK. It was a 33-year-old undergraduate student who was struck by a car as he was jogging. Now, this patient was interesting in the sense that this patient was suffering from what is called visual agnosia. Again, if you want to talk about, learn about more about visual agnosia, you probably can refer to the earlier course. But visual agnosia basically is an inability to visually recognize objects. It's not an inability to perceive things. So the person can perceive different aspects of the object. So it is this shape, it is this color, those kind of things, but people generally are not able to integrate all of these feature level representations into a whole and say that this is this particular object. So this person was suffering from visual agnosia, and he started to label things. If you're talking to him about a badminton racket, he would say that this is the fencer's mask. He's basically just seeing the center where the net is there, and he would basically label it as the fencer's mask because he's not being able to integrate the handle to this to this net. Now, CK could recognize parts of the object, but again could not integrate them into a meaningful whole. But despite this inability, despite his inability to name pictures of objects, CK was able to draw objects from mental imagery in completely rich detail and same objects. And this task basically depends upon what is called mental imagery, because if you have to recall something and draw it, obviously you are making use of what is your mental imagery. Now, interestingly, when CK was shown his own drawings after a particular time has passed, so that he would have forgotten that he had himself drawn this, when CK was actually shown these drawings, he was again unable to even identify the objects he had drawn. He kind of showed no recall of the fact that he has himself drawn these things, and the fact that again he would not recall a racket that he has drawn himself. He will again label it as a fencer's mask. Now, this is something strange. This is a sort of a dissociation that is happening between visual imagery and visual perception. Now, Behrman and colleagues are trying to explain this from a slightly theoretical point of view, and what they are saying is it's quite possible that mechanisms of perception and imagery are overlapping only partially. And how? And there are some regions that are mediating. Some mediation is there from perception, which is located at both lower level visual areas and higher level visual areas. And the mechanism for imagery is basically located mainly in the higher visual areas. So, how does perception work? If I try and revise one of the the last course I've given you, the idea is the visual perception necessarily involves what is called bottom up perception. It starts as early as when the light is entering your retina and when an image is formed, and then this goes to through the visual pathways to early visual areas, primary visual cortex, V1, V2, V3 others, and then it goes to higher visual areas where things are combined together. Okay, where you start combining these edge level and feature level descriptions into particular objects. So, that is how visual perception works. Now, what they are saying is the visual cortex is crucial for perception, because it is here that this integration of components or the analysis of the incoming signal into components is happening, and then this information goes to higher visual areas where all of this is integrated and assembled together to form a unitary solid perception of a particular object. Now, in contrast, imagery might not need all of this visual input. Imagery is probably operating at whatever you already have. You have a pre-assembled version of, let us say, a particular object, and imagery basically needs to just pull out those pre-assembled versions, and that is why mental images are supposed to be they are accessing the pre-assembled versions. So, they do not really depend upon the activation of cortical areas so much as the visual cortex, because there is no input that needs to be processed here. Perception will actually depend on activation starting from the retina to the primary visual cortex to the visual association areas, but imagery in that sense can just pick up from the visual association areas, and then again you can perform all sorts of manipulations that you would want to do. So, this is little bit about how brain and mental imagery might be related and how there could be probable links between visual perception and visual imagery. I think I've come to the end of this chapter on mental imagery. I hoped you liked the chapter, and I hoped you liked all the information that was presented here, and then we'll meet next week with a new topic.